The scent of time clung to Ilara Vance's hands, a delicate, dry perfume of aging paper, worn leather, and the faint, vanilla-like sweetness of lignin decay. At 23, her world had shrunk to the dimensions of the restorer's bench where she spent her days. With the precision of a surgeon, she coaxed life back into the spines of forgotten stories, her slender fingers tracing the faded gold leaf on a centuries-old cover. Each book was a patient, its wounds a history she treated with reverent patience. She mended tears with Japanese tissue so thin it was nearly invisible, and reinforced bindings with a gentle strength she rarely afforded herself. In this quiet, dusty sanctuary, she was in complete control, a master of a silent kingdom. But the stories she saved were always someone else's, a stark reminder of the unwritten pages of her own life. If you want to discover what forces a woman who mends the past to confront a terrifying future, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. We continue. Her workshop was a cloistered haven, tucked away in the forgotten corner of a city that thrummed with a life she only observed from a distance. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, fell in slanted bars across towering shelves, crammed with the literary dead and dying. This was her self-imposed exile, a fortress built of paper and glue. Ilara Vance moved through this space not like its owner, but like another of its quiet ghosts. Her clothes were simple, her hair often pinned up hastily, and her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, held a deep, watchful stillness. She had learned to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible, a skill honed by a life of deferring her own needs. The world outside was loud, chaotic, and demanding. Here, the only demands were the silent pleas of broken books. This carefully constructed solitude was a shield. Ilara was a virgin, not from any devout moral conviction, but from a profound, paralyzing fear of vulnerability. Intimacy felt like a language she had never been taught, a landscape she was terrified to navigate. To be seen, truly seen by another person, felt like the ultimate exposure, a risk her fragile sense of self could not withstand. Her life had been a series of duties, first as a daughter to an ailing mother, now as a guardian of fragile artifacts. Her own desires were foreign territory, unexplored and overgrown with the weeds of responsibility and fear. The silence of her workshop was both a comfort and a constant, aching confirmation of her profound loneliness, a quiet so deep it had its own sound, the hum of a life on hold. The pressure to maintain this fragile peace was immense and arrived daily in thin white envelopes. Her mother's medical bills were a relentless tide, threatening to pull her under. Each letter, with its bold red-lettered warnings and escalating numbers, was a fresh wave of panic that tightened its icy grip around her chest. She worked longer hours, taking on more delicate and thus more lucrative projects, her hands often aching by nightfall. The meticulous craft that was once her passion had become a desperate race against insolvency. Every perfectly restored page, every reinforced spine, was another small payment toward a debt that felt infinite. She was selling her time, her skill, and her youth, not for a future of her own, but simply to keep the past and her mother's fragile health from collapsing entirely. Sometimes she would pause, a bone folder held motionless in her hand, and simply watch the world through the large, grimy window of her street-level workshop. She saw couples walk by, their hands intertwined, their laughter a sound from a different universe. She watched groups of friends spill out of the nearby cafe, their easy camaraderie a painful spectacle of the connection she craved and feared in equal measure. In those moments, the glass felt like a barrier between two dimensions. Their world of vibrant, messy, unpredictable life, and her own a static tableau of quiet, controlled decay. Her reflection, superimposed over the lively street scene, looked pale and ephemeral, a ghost haunting the edges of existence, forever looking in but never daring to step out into the light. The strain was beginning to manifest in her work, the one place she had always found solace and control. One afternoon, while applying a delicate line of gold leaf to the spine of a rare poetry collection, her hand trembled. The minuscule tremor was almost imperceptible, but to Ilara it felt like a seismic event. It was a betrayal by her own body, a physical manifestation of the internal chaos she fought so hard to suppress. The fortress was beginning to show cracks. The weight of her responsibilities, the gnawing loneliness, and the constant simmering anxiety were eroding her foundations. The very control that defined her existence was slipping through her fingers like fine sand. And the terrifying realization dawned that her quiet, predictable world was no longer sustainable. It was a prison whose walls were slowly, inexorably closing in. It was in this state of quiet desperation that she saw it. The advertisement was not in a newspaper or a trade journal, but on the small, glowing screen of her phone. A stark, digital intrusion into her analog world. The listing was for a private evening caregiver, with duties described in cold, clinical, and unnervingly vague terms. The position required no formal medical training, but demanded discretion, patience, and resilience. The salary offered was staggering, a sum so large it made her breath catch in her throat. It was enough to erase her mother's debt, to silence the threatening letters, to finally allow her a moment to breathe. The offer was a lifeline, but the unspoken implications of the job felt like an anchor, threatening to pull her down into unknown and dangerous depths. Her finger hovered over the apply button, a single, terrifying choice between her sanctuary and her survival. The walk home was a journey of shedding one skin for another. Ilara left the comforting dust of her workshop and stepped into the cool, indifferent air of the early evening. The city exhaled its daily fatigue around her. The rumble of a distant train, the weary shuffle of commuters, the sharp scent of street food she could never afford. She lived in a neighborhood of forgotten grandeur, where ornate brick buildings sagged under the weight of time and neglect, much like the books she tended. Her own building was a testament to this decay, its once proud entryway now scarred with graffiti. With each step up the echoing, dimly lit staircase to her third-floor apartment, the quiet control she cultivated during the day dissolved, replaced by a familiar, heavy sense of obligation. Her shoulders, which had been relaxed over her workbench, instinctively tensed, bracing for the atmosphere that awaited her inside. The apartment she shared with her mother was small, meticulously clean, but suffocatingly still. It smelled not of home, but of a holding pattern, a faint antiseptic tang of medication overlaid with the scent of lemon polish and steeped tea. The air was thick with unspoken history and the heavy presence of illness. Every object had its designated place, a rigid order that offered no comfort, only a constant reminder of the fragility it was meant to protect. The furniture was worn but well kept, relics from a life before her father's departure and her mother's decline. A gallery of faded photographs lined the narrow hallway, showcasing a happier family, a younger Ilara with a smile that now felt like it belonged to a stranger. This was not a sanctuary. It was a sick room, a shrine to a past she was tasked with preserving at the cost of her own future. Her mother, Eleanor, was always seated in the same worn armchair by the window, a sentinel guarding the threshold between the living room and the world outside. Sickness had thinned her body, but not her will. Her eyes, a paler version of Ilara's, were sharp and perpetually disappointed. She ruled their small world from that chair, her love a complex, tangled thing, interwoven with threads of guilt, fear, and expectation. She greeted Ilara not with a warm embrace, but with a critical once-over, her gaze assessing her daughter's posture, her clothes, the weariness in her eyes. Every conversation was a delicate dance around the landmines of Eleanor's anxieties. Ilara's life was not her own. It was a project her mother managed, a final attempt to secure a legacy of stability and propriety that had eluded her own grasp. The evening ritual began without a word. Ilara would set down her bag, wash her hands, and prepare her mother's tea. The clink of the ceramic cup against the saucer, the only sound in the tense silence. She would arrange the small assortment of pills in the daily dispenser, her book-mending fingers now handling the fragile capsules of her mother's continued existence. The conversation, when it came, was a familiar script. Eleanor would inquire about her day in a way that wasn't a question, but an audit, seeking reassurance that Ilara was working hard, that she was being responsible. Each of Ilara's careful, edited answers was designed to soothe, to placate, to prevent the inevitable turn toward the topics that made her skin crawl. Her solitude, her future, her conspicuous lack of a suitor. A young woman shouldn't spend all her time with the dead, Eleanor would often say, her voice a fragile rasp, gesturing vaguely toward the idea of Ilara's workshop. The statement was a carefully crafted opening, a preamble to the lecture on the importance of finding a good, stable man. For Eleanor, marriage was not about love or passion. It was a transaction, a necessary alliance for survival. It was about securing a future where the bills were paid, where a daughter was taken care of. She saw Ilara's virginity and shyness not as a part of her daughter's complex inner world, but as a liability, a flaw in the product she was trying to present to the world. Ilara would simply nod, her throat tight, the unspoken chasm between their desires widening with every passing day. Later, when her mother was settled in for the night, the true weight of her reality would descend. Ilara would sit at the small kitchen table under the harsh glare of a single fluorescent bulb, the stack of white envelopes her only company. She would spread them out like a losing hand in a game she was forced to play. The cold black ink of the figures, hospital stays, prescription costs, specialist fees, seemed to mock her efforts. The money she earned, the product of her painstaking, meticulous labor, felt like a handful of sand thrown against a relentless tide of debt.
This was the true nature of her prison. It wasn't just the small apartment or her mother's expectations. It was a cage built of numbers, a life sentence measured in dollars and cents. This suffocating sense of duty was rooted in a past Ilara barely remembered, but was forced to honor. Her mother had sacrificed everything after her husband left, working 2 jobs to keep their small apartment, her body slowly breaking under the strain. Eleanor's current bitterness was the corrosive residue of that sacrifice. She saw her daughter's obedience as the only acceptable form of repayment. In her mind, she had given Ilara a life, and now Ilara owed her a secure and respectable death, free from the indignity of charity or state assistance. This unspoken debt was the heaviest of all, a moral and emotional burden that chained Ilara to her mother's side, making any thought of personal freedom feel like a profound and selfish betrayal of the woman who had given her everything. Lying in her narrow bed, the sounds of the city muted by the glass, Ilara would trace the cracks in her ceiling, imagining they were rivers leading to somewhere else, anywhere else. This was when the conflict raged most fiercely within her. The dutiful daughter warred with a silent, terrified woman who yearned for a life she couldn't even articulate. What would it feel like to make a choice just for herself? To feel the touch of another person, not as a duty or a threat, but as a genuine connection? The questions were dangerous, whispers of a rebellion she didn't have the courage to stage. Her own story felt unwritten, its pages blank and stuck together, while she spent her days meticulously preserving the grand narratives of others. Her isolation was nearly absolute. The few friends she'd had in school had long since moved on, their lives filled with careers, partners, and adventures she only saw in brief, painful flashes on social media. An occasional text message would arrive, an invitation to a world she no longer knew how to enter. She would type out a polite excuse, the lie of being too busy, a convenient shield for the truth. She had forgotten how to be anyone other than a restorer and a caregiver. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of a book page and a sick room, and the silence that surrounded her was no longer a choice, but a defining feature of her existence, a quiet that screamed with the sound of a life unlived. It was in this crucible of silent desperation, with the image of the red-lettered bills burned into her mind, that she would open her phone again, the screen a stark, cold light in the darkness of her room. The advertisement for the private evening caregiver seemed to pulse with a terrifying energy. It was grotesque, invasive, and an affront to the carefully guarded privacy of her own body and soul. But the salary, that impossible number, was a key. It was a brutal, ugly, but potentially effective tool to dismantle the bars of her financial cage. The choice became terrifyingly clear. She could remain in this familiar prison, slowly suffocating under the weight of duty and debt, or she could step into a new, unknown one, hoping that its gilded walls might offer a different kind of survival. The address she had been given did not belong to a mere building. It was a monument of glass and steel that pierced the sky, a declaration of wealth so immense it seemed to bend the very fabric of the city around it. As Alara Vance stepped into the lobby, she felt her own world shrink to an insignificant speck. The air was cool and sterile, smelling of nothing at all, a stark contrast to the rich, organic scent of old paper she carried with her like a second skin. The floors were polished black marble that reflected a distorted, wavering version of herself, a ghost trespassing in a palace. A silent, terrifyingly fast elevator carried her upward, the city sprawling beneath her like a map of a life she could see but never touch. With each ascending floor, the pressure in her ears was matched only by the frantic tightening knot of anxiety in her stomach. A woman with a severe haircut and an expression of perpetual disapproval led her from the elevator into the penthouse. The front door opened not into a home, but into a vast, empty expanse of space and light. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the room, displaying a breathtaking panoramic view of the city that felt more like an exhibit than a vista. The furniture was sparse, architectural, and cold, a collection of sharp angles in shades of gray, white, and black. There were no photographs, no clutter, no books. It was less a living space and more a mausoleum for a life that had ceased to be lived. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, an oppressive silence that was heavier and more profound than the quiet of her own workshop. She felt exposed, her simple dress and worn shoes a vulgar stain on the pristine canvas of this world. He was by the window, his back to her, a dark silhouette against the bleeding colors of the sunset. Julian Croft did not immediately turn, a deliberate, calculated gesture of power that made her feel like an unwelcome interruption. He was seated in a wheelchair, but it was unlike any she had ever seen. Forged from carbon fiber and matte black metal, it looked less like a medical device and more like a throne, an extension of the cold, technological empire he had once commanded.
The silence stretched, thin and taut, each second a small eternity in which Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She stood frozen just inside the doorway, waiting to be acknowledged, feeling the full, crushing weight of his world and her desperate intrusion into it. The king was in his castle, and she was the supplicant at the gate. When he finally turned, the motion was fluid, controlled by a near-silent motor. The face that met hers was a study in harsh beauty and profound bitterness. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 35, with sharp, intelligent features that were marred by the deep lines of chronic pain and a chilling emptiness around his mouth. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a piercing, glacial blue, and they burned with a cold, contained fury that seemed to scorch everything they landed on. He looked at her not as a person, but as an object, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe in a stark, clinical evaluation that stripped her bare. There was no greeting, no preamble, just the silent, dismissive judgment of a man who had long since decided the world and everyone in it was a disappointment. "The agency said you were resilient." Julian Croft's voice was a low, resonant baritone, but it was devoid of any warmth, each word clipped and precise. He didn't ask about her qualifications or her past experience. His questions were not designed to learn about her, but to dismantle her. "The duties are not for the faint of heart. They are personal, intimate. You will be responsible for my physical care in the evenings. This includes bathing." He stated the final word with a deliberate, brutal frankness, his icy gaze fixed on her face, watching, waiting for her to flinch, to blush, to show any sign of the revulsion or pity he so clearly expected. He was daring her to crumble, to reveal the weakness he was certain lay beneath her deceptively calm exterior. He wanted her to run. A wave of heat and shame washed over. The silence stretched, thin and taut, each second a small eternity in which Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She stood frozen just inside the doorway, waiting to be acknowledged, feeling the full, crushing weight of his world and her desperate intrusion into it. The king was in his castle, and she was the supplicant at the gate. When he finally turned, the motion was fluid, controlled by a near-silent motor. The face that met hers was a study in harsh beauty and profound bitterness. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 35, with sharp, intelligent features that were marred by the deep lines of chronic pain and a chilling emptiness around his mouth. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a piercing, glacial blue, and they burned with a cold, contained fury that seemed to scorch everything they landed on. He looked at her not as a person, but as an object, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe in a stark, clinical evaluation that stripped her bare. There was no greeting, no preamble, just the silent, dismissive judgment of a man who had long since decided the world and everyone in it was a disappointment. "The agency said you were resilient." Julian Croft's voice was a low, resonant baritone, but it was devoid of any warmth, each word clipped and precise. He didn't ask about her qualifications or her past experience. His questions were not designed to learn about her, but to dismantle her. "The duties are not for the faint of heart. They are personal, intimate. You will be responsible for my physical care in the evenings. This includes bathing."
He stated the final word with a deliberate, brutal frankness, his icy gaze fixed on her face, watching, waiting for her to flinch, to blush, to show any sign of the revulsion or pity he so clearly expected. He was daring her to crumble, to reveal the weakness he was certain lay beneath her deceptively calm exterior. He wanted her to run. A wave of heat and shame washed over Alara, so potent it made her dizzy. Every fiber of her being, every carefully constructed wall she had built around her private, untouched self, screamed in protest. The thought of such intimacy, so clinical and devoid of emotion, was a violation she could barely comprehend. Her instinct was to turn and flee, to retreat to the familiar safety of her dusty books and quiet solitude. But then, unbidden, the image of her mother's pale, worried face appeared in her mind, followed by the stark red ink of a final notice. The fear of failing her mother was a deeper, more primal terror than the one she faced now. She lifted her chin, her throat tight, and met his challenging stare. Her own eyes, the color of moss, did not hold defiance, but a profound, quiet, and unbreakable desperation. Her stillness seemed to unnerve him. It was clear he was accustomed to a different reaction, to stammered apologies, to horrified disgust, to hasty retreats. Ilara's quiet, unwavering gaze was a response he had not anticipated, and for a fleeting moment the mask of cold fury slipped. A flicker of something unreadable, surprise, perhaps, or a grudging respect, passed through his eyes before being immediately extinguished. He had used his vulnerability as a weapon, a tool to drive people away, and she had refused to be wounded by it. She had simply absorbed the blow. This unexpected resilience seemed to both irritate and intrigue him. He had presented her with the ugliest part of his reality, and she had not looked away, forcing him to see her as something more than just another easily dismissed caregiver. "The position is yours, if you want it," he said, the words sharp, as if the offer itself were an inconvenience. He named a salary, a figure so astronomical it hung in the air between them, a tangible weight that represented the precise cost of her privacy, her fear, and her submission. It was not a job offer, it was a transaction. He was purchasing her fortitude, her steady hands, and his presence in the most vulnerable moments of his life. Ilara felt the invisible contract settle over her, its terms written in the ink of her desperation. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The word yes was a small, choked sound in the vast silence of the room, the final, decisive click of a key turning in the lock of a new and terrifying cage. As the severe assistant reappeared to show her out, Julian's gaze dropped from her face to her hands. He noticed them for the first time. The slender, capable fingers, the faint, pale calluses on her fingertips from years of handling delicate tools, the almost invisible trace of gold leaf shimmering under one of her nails. They were not the soft, manicured hands of the women who typically moved through his world. They were the hands of a worker, a restorer, a person who mended what was broken. They possessed a quiet strength and purpose that stood in stark contrast to his own hands, which now served only to grip the controls of his chair. The observation was fleeting, but it was the first time he had looked at any part of her with something other than cold assessment. That single brief moment planted a seed. For Alara, his intense focus on her hands was strangely intimate, a form of being seen that bypassed the shame and fear of the interview. He hadn't seen a timid, desperate woman, but a craftsman. For Julian, her unyielding composure and the quiet competence of her hands presented an unwelcome anomaly.
She was not like the others who had come before, filled with pity or greed. She was something different, a quiet force he could not immediately categorize or dismiss. This thought, unsettling and strangely persistent, lingered in his mind long after she was gone. A single, complex note in the profound, echoing silence of his gilded prison, leaving him alone with the city lights and the ghost of an unexpected fascination.
The first weeks settled into a tense, unspoken rhythm, a liturgy of sterile efficiency performed in the cathedral of his bathroom. The space was an echo chamber of marble and chrome, where every sound, the rush of water, the soft slide of a washcloth, the quiet click of a soap dish, was amplified into something significant and unsettling. Elara Vance moved with the same meticulous precision she applied to her books, her actions deliberate and impersonal. She treated his body as an object, a complex and fragile artifact to be cleaned and cared for, divorcing the act from the man. This clinical detachment was her armor, a necessary shield against the profound vulnerability of their situation. In this arena, he was the helpless one, and she held all the physical power, a truth so potent and terrifying that she dared not acknowledge it, even to herself. Julian Croft, in turn, wielded silence as his primary weapon. He would watch her, his glacial blue eyes tracking her every movement, his expression an unreadable mask of resentment and contempt. He offered no assistance, no word of guidance, forcing her to navigate the geography of his inert body on her own. His stillness was an accusation, his silence a judgment. Occasionally, he would issue a clipped command, his voice a shard of ice in the steam-filled air, designed to remind her of her place, to assert the power he still possessed. He was testing her, pushing at the boundaries of her composure, searching for a crack in her professional facade. He wanted her to break, to show disgust or pity, to give him a reason to dismiss her as he had all the others. But Elara simply absorbed his hostility, her quiet competence a silent, infuriating rebuttal. The air between them was thick with a low, humming tension, an awareness that defied the sterile environment. It was in the details, the clean, sharp scent of the soap mingling with the faint, warm scent of his skin, the heat from the water that ghosted across her own arms, the heavy, rhythmic sound of his breathing in the quiet. She became acutely aware of the texture of his skin beneath the washcloth, the hard lines of muscle in his shoulders and arms that spoke of a former strength, a life lived before the chair. These were dangerous observations, intrusions into a territory she had sworn to herself she would not enter. She would push them away, focusing on the task, on the mechanics of the job, her heart beating a steady, anxious rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat marking the slow, agonizing passage of time. The first crack in their silent truce was not a word, but a reflection. One evening, as she was rinsing his hair, her movements careful and practiced, she glanced up and met his eyes in the vast, polished mirror that covered the opposite wall. It was an accidental collision of gazes, stripped of the usual power dynamic. In the reflection, they were just two people, their images softened and made strange by the steam. For a fraction of a second, she saw past the cold fury in his eyes and glimpsed something else, a flicker of profound, bottomless exhaustion, a weariness so deep it seemed to anchor him to the earth. He looked away instantly, his jaw tightening, but the image was seared into her mind. The monster had shown her a glimpse of the prisoner trapped within, and the sight left an indelible mark on her. He began to notice things about her, too, small, inconsequential details that broke through his self-imposed isolation. He noticed the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture of concentration that was both graceful and unconsciously vulnerable. He registered the faint, dry scent of old paper and vanilla that clung to her clothes, a stark contrast to the sterile nothingness of her penthouse. One night, as she reached for a towel, the cuff of her sleeve rode up, revealing a small, faded scar on her wrist. He found himself wondering about its origin, a flicker of curiosity that was as unwelcome as it was persistent. She was no longer just a pair of capable hands. She was becoming a person, a quiet, steady presence whose story was a mystery he was beginning, against his will, to want to solve.
This growing awareness began to bleed into the moments after the bath, in the quiet of the main living area. The silence between them changed its texture, shifting from hostile to expectant. He would delay dismissing her, his fingers resting on the controls of his chair, his gaze fixed on the city lights below. Ilara, in turn, would linger by the door, a strange reluctance to leave, warring with her desperate need to escape. The unspoken questions hung in the air, heavy and fragile. It was a dangerous, liminal space where the roles of employer and caregiver blurred at the edges, and the stark reality of their shared intimacy could no longer be ignored. They were two isolated souls, orbiting each other in a vast, empty universe, the gravitational pull between them growing stronger with each passing night, threatening to pull them from their carefully maintained orbits.
The shift, when it came, was not born from a word or a look, but from a simple, clumsy accident. The evening ritual was almost complete. The air was thick with steam, and Ilara, her muscles aching with a familiar weariness, was reaching for the soap for a final time. Her fingers, slick with water, failed to find a firm purchase. The bar of white soap slipped from her grasp, landing with a soft, wet sound against his thigh before sliding into the water between his legs. It was a mundane mistake, a trivial slip, but in the charged atmosphere of that room, it was a cataclysmic event. The professional rhythm was shattered, the careful distance she maintained instantly erased, leaving them both exposed in the sudden, shocking silence that followed. For a heartbeat, Ilara froze, her mind a blank slate of panic. Her gaze was locked on the place where the soap had disappeared beneath the water, a location of such profound intimacy that she could not bring herself to look at it directly. Retrieving it was a violation of every unspoken rule they had established. Leaving it was an impossibility. Her breath caught in her throat, a knot of heat and shame tightening in her chest. She could feel his eyes on her, his silence more intense than any shouted command. The choice was simple, and yet monumental. She had to reach into that water. She had to touch him in a way that was no longer clinical or professional, a way that could not be misinterpreted by either of them. The world seemed to narrow to that single, terrifying point of contact. Taking a shallow, unsteady breath, she leaned forward. Her hand, trembling slightly, broke the surface of the warm water. Her fingers brushed against the hard muscle of his inner thigh, a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity shooting up her arm. It was the first time their skin had met without the mediating presence of a cloth or sponge. The contact was shocking in its intimacy, a sudden, searing awareness of him, not as a patient or an employer, but as a man. His skin was warm, alive. His body tensed under her touch, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, the only sound he... The shift, when it came, was not born from a word or a look, but from a simple, clumsy accident. The evening ritual was almost complete. The air was thick with steam, and Ilara, her muscles aching with a familiar weariness, was reaching for the soap for a final time. Her fingers, slick with water, failed to find a firm purchase. The bar of white soap slipped from her grasp, landing with a soft, wet sound against his thigh before sliding into the water between his legs. It was a mundane mistake, a trivial slip, but in the charged atmosphere of that room, it was a cataclysmic event. The professional rhythm was shattered, the careful distance she maintained instantly erased, leaving them both exposed in the sudden, shocking silence that followed. For a heartbeat, Ilara froze, her mind a blank slate of panic. Her gaze was locked on the place where the soap had disappeared beneath the water, a location of such profound intimacy that she could not bring herself to look at it directly. Retrieving it was a violation of every unspoken rule they had established. Leaving it was an impossibility. Her breath caught in her throat, a knot of heat and shame tightening in her chest. She could feel his eyes on her, his silence more intense than any shouted command.
The choice was simple and yet monumental. She had to reach into that water. She had to touch him in a way that was no longer clinical or professional, a way that could not be misinterpreted by either of them. The world seemed to narrow to that single, terrifying point of contact. Taking a shallow, unsteady breath, she leaned forward. Her hand, trembling slightly, broke the surface of the warm water. Her fingers brushed against the hard muscle of his inner thigh, a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity shooting up her arm. It was the first time their skin had met without the mediating presence of a cloth or sponge. The contact was shocking in its intimacy, a sudden, searing awareness of him not as a patient or an employer, but as a man. His skin was warm, alive. His body tensed under her touch, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath the only sound he made. Her fingers closed around the slippery soap, but she couldn't pull away, momentarily paralyzed by the overwhelming sensory input. The heat, the texture, the raw, undeniable reality of his physical presence. When she finally drew her hand back, the bar of soap clutched tightly in her palm. The professional barrier between them was gone, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She couldn't meet his eyes. She finished her tasks in a blur of motion, her hands shaking, her face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the steam. The air was no longer just tense, it was alive, crackling with a new and dangerous energy. When she was done and he was settled, he did not dismiss her immediately. The silence that fell was different, heavy with the weight of that single, sustained moment of contact. The clinical arena had become something else entirely, a space where a forbidden and terrifying connection had just been irrevocably forged. The hand that held the soap now felt branded by the memory of his skin. The incident became a silent turning point. Their interactions, once confined to terse commands and professional acknowledgments, began to tentatively expand. One evening, as she prepared to leave, he spoke, his voice low and unexpectedly rough. "The books," he said, not looking at her. "What kind of books do you mend?" The question was a peace offering, a small, grudging bridge built across the chasm of their silence. Stunned, Ilara found herself telling him about the delicate art of restoring vellum, of tooling leather, of saving stories from the ravages of time. She spoke of her work with a quiet passion he had never heard in her voice before. And for the first time he listened not as a master to a servant, but as one lonely person listening to another. These conversations became a fragile nightly ritual. He would ask about her world of paper and ink, and she, in turn, grew bold enough to ask about his. She learned about the clean, logical world of code he had once inhabited, a universe of perfect systems and predictable outcomes that stood in stark contrast to the messy, unpredictable prison his body had become. He spoke of his past with a detached bitterness, as if describing the life of a stranger. But Ilara saw through the cynicism. She saw the ghost of a man who had loved creation, who had found beauty in the elegant structure of an algorithm, just as she found it in the perfect binding of a book. They were both restorers in their own way, and this shared fundamental nature drew them closer, even as they both fought against the pull. This newfound intimacy was a source of profound and terrifying conflict for Ilara. She would lie awake in her narrow bed, the memory of his voice, the intensity of his gaze, the shocking feel of his skin replaying in her mind. For the first time in her life, she was experiencing the dizzying, chaotic pull of desire. She wanted to know more about him, to break through the walls of his bitterness, to touch him again, not as a caregiver, but as something else. This yearning was a betrayal of everything she had built her life upon. Her carefully constructed world of control and self-denial was being threatened by a force she couldn't manage or contain.
The man who was her key to financial freedom was becoming the potential destroyer of her emotional sanctuary. The dilemma was a constant, tearing presence in her thoughts. Her duty was to her mother, to the crushing weight of the bills that this job, and only this job, could solve. To jeopardize it by indulging in these dangerous feelings was an act of profound selfishness. And yet, the connection with Julian felt like the first truly authentic thing in her life. With him, in that strange, sterile penthouse, she felt seen in a way she never had before. He saw her strength, her competence, not just her quiet obedience. The choice became a brutal internal war. The safety of her controlled, lonely existence versus the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of a connection that felt as vital and necessary as breathing. To desire him was to risk everything, but to deny that desire felt like a different kind of death. Julian was fighting his own battle. Every flicker of warmth he felt toward her, every moment of genuine curiosity, was immediately met with a savage internal backlash. He would follow a moment of shared understanding with an act of calculated cruelty, a sharp, cutting remark designed to push her away, to reestablish the distance that felt safe. He saw the burgeoning softness in her eyes, and it terrified him. To let her in was to risk feeling again, to be vulnerable to a pain he was not sure he could survive a second time. He had built his fortress of bitterness for a reason, and he would not allow this quiet, resilient woman to dismantle it brick by brick. He was drawn to her light, but he believed his own darkness would only extinguish it. The tension reached a breaking point one rainy Tuesday night. Julian was agitated, the damp weather seeping into his bones and aggravating his chronic nerve pain. He was more short-tempered than usual, his commands clipped and harsh. As Ilara was helping him transfer from the bath to his chair, a sudden violent muscle spasm seized his entire lower body. It was a brutal, horrifying sight. His legs jerking uncontrollably, his body contorting with an agony that ripped a raw, strangled cry from his throat. His carefully maintained mask of control was obliterated in an instant, leaving him utterly exposed, a prisoner being tortured by his own flesh. The raw animal sound of his pain echoed off the marble walls, striking Ilara with the force of a physical blow. In that moment, her training, her professionalism, her fear, it all evaporated. She did not reach for the emergency call button or retreat to a safe distance. Her reaction was purely instinctual, a wave of overwhelming compassion that swamped every other thought. She moved toward him, her hands finding his shoulders, her voice a low, soothing murmur. "It's okay," she whispered, the words inadequate but filled with a genuine, heartfelt empathy. "I'm here, just breathe." She held him steady, her touch no longer that of a caregiver, but of one human being offering comfort to another in their moment of greatest weakness. It was a profound transgression of their unspoken rules, an act of pure, unadulterated intimacy. And Julian, for the first time, did not push her away. He surrendered to it, his body trembling, his ragged breathing the only sound in the room as he allowed her to hold him through the storm. The tremor in his body subsided slowly, leaving a profound, echoing stillness in its wake. The cold marble of the bathroom, once an arena of silent warfare, now felt like a sacred, fragile space. Ilara did not release him immediately. Her hands remained on her shoulders, a steady, grounding presence against the violent aftershocks of her pain. She could feel the hard knot of muscle beneath his damp skin begin to soften, a reluctant surrender. In that moment, she was no longer the caregiver, and he was no longer the master of the house. They were simply two people, stripped bare of their roles, bound together by a shared moment of raw, unvarnished vulnerability.
The professional line she had so carefully drawn had not just been crossed, it had been utterly erased by the force of his agony and her instinctual compassion. The air was thick with the unspoken, a truth so powerful it was terrifying. He allowed her to help him into his robe and back into his chair without a word of protest, his usual defenses shattered. The journey from the bathroom to the main living area was conducted in a heavy silence, but its quality had changed. It was no longer the hostile, weaponized silence of their early days, but a fragile, contemplative quiet filled with the weight of what had just passed between them. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally broke, streaming down the vast windows and blurring the city lights into a watercolor wash of neon and gold. The sound of it, a soft, persistent drumming, insulated them from the world, creating an intimate cocoon in the heart of the sterile penthouse. He positioned his chair near the window, not looking at her, but she knew he was intensely aware of her every breath, every slight movement. Her shift was over. The clock on the wall confirmed it with a silent digital glare. Duty called to her from across the city. The small, suffocating apartment, her mother's expectant face, the familiar weight of her obligations. The responsible part of her, the girl who had always done what was required, screamed at her to gather her things and leave.
But another voice, a quieter, more insistent whisper she had never heard before, urged her to stay. To leave now would be to abandon this fragile new territory they had just discovered. It would be a retreat to a safety that had long since become its own kind of prison. In a single decisive act of rebellion against her entire life, Ilara Vance made a choice for herself. She took a quiet step away from the door and moved further into the room. From her bag, she retrieved a small, cloth-wrapped object. She had brought it on a whim, a foolish, hopeful impulse she hadn't fully understood until this very moment. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small leather-bound volume of Keats' poetry, its spine lovingly restored by her own hands. The book felt warm and alive in her palms, a piece of her soul, a stark, organic contrast to the cold glass and steel that surrounded them. "I thought maybe you'd like to hear something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the vast room with perfect clarity. It was an offering, a profound transgression of her role. She was no longer just tending to his body. She was daring to tend to the man inside, a far more dangerous and intimate task. She sat on a low ottoman near his chair, close enough that she could feel the faint warmth radiating from him, and opened the book. She began to read Ode to a Nightingale, her voice soft and steady, the melodic cadence of the verse filling the quiet space between them. She did not read with theatrical flair, but with the simple, honest reverence of someone who truly loved the words. Julian remained silent, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window, but she saw the rigid line of his jaw soften, the tight grip of his hands on the arms of his chair relax, finger by finger. The poetry, with its themes of beauty, pain, and mortality, was seeping past his defenses, speaking a language his wounded soul understood. He was listening not with condescension or impatience, but with a deep, unsettling stillness, as if her voice were the only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. When the final line faded into the sound of the rain, a long, heavy silence fell. Then his voice, rough with an emotion she had never heard before, broke it. "She loved that poem," he said, the words costing him a visible effort. He finally turned his head from the window, and his eyes, stripped of their usual fury, were haunted, raw. He began to speak, not in a narrative, but in broken fragments, the story of the accident torn from him piece by piece. The slick road, the flash of headlights, the sound of shattering glass.
He spoke of his fiancée, Amelia, of her laughter, of the future they had planned. And then he spoke of his own guilt, a corrosive living thing that had been eating him alive for 2 years. "I was driving," he confessed, his voice cracking. "It should have been me." Ilara listened, her heart aching with a pain so profound it felt like her own. She did not offer empty words of comfort or absolution. She knew instinctively that pity was the last thing he needed. Instead, she offered him the powerful healing gift of her unwavering presence. She simply saw him, all of him, the broken body, the shattered heart, the crushing weight of his grief, and she did not look away. Her quiet, empathetic stillness created a space safe enough for his agony to exist without judgment. In her moss-green eyes, he found not a reflection of his own monstrosity, but a deep, resonant understanding that felt like grace. He had shown her the ugliest, most painful part of himself, the secret that had fueled his rage and isolation, and she had met it not with horror, but with a quiet, accepting strength. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out, his hand closing over hers where it rested on the cover of the book. His touch was not forceful, but it was electric, a current of desperate, undeniable connection that shot through her entire body. He used his grip on her hand to pull himself slightly forward in his chair, his gaze locked on hers, a silent, raw question in his eyes. The space between them shrank, charged with an intensity that made the air feel thin, difficult to breathe. This was it, the precipice she had been both dreading and yearning for. Her own life, with its fears and its carefully guarded virginity, felt like a distant memory. There was only this room, this man, and this single, terrifying, inevitable moment that would change the entire topography of her world. His lips met hers with a hesitant, desperate pressure. It was not a kiss of practiced seduction, but of raw, soul-bearing need. It tasted of rain and salt and 2 years of unspoken sorrow. For Ilara, the sensation was a cataclysm, a dizzying, overwhelming flood that shattered every wall she had ever built. A wave of heat, sharp and potent, washed through her, followed by a profound, trembling vulnerability. She surrendered to it completely, her hand lifting to cup his jaw, her fingers tracing the rough texture of his skin. It was a kiss of firsts and lasts, the first time she had ever truly let someone in, and the first time he had allowed himself to feel anything other than rage. In that single, searing point of contact, 2 profoundly lonely worlds collided, merging in a tender, heartbreaking, and irrevocable fusion. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, the sound of their ragged breathing mingling with the soft drumming of the rain.
The air between them shimmered, thick with the aftermath of the confession and the kiss. Nothing had been solved, and yet everything had changed. He had given her his deepest wound, and she had answered with a surrender that went far beyond her physical innocence. She had given him a part of her soul. He looked at her, his glacial blue eyes now dark with a complex storm of emotions, gratitude, fear, and a dawning, terrifying tenderness. The transgression was complete. She had stepped out of her story and into his, and she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that there was no going back to the quiet, predictable life she had left behind. The dawn that followed was a fragile, hesitant thing, filtering through the vast windows in shades of gray and bruised purple. The penthouse was unnervingly silent, the air thick with the ghosts of the night's confession and the lingering scent of rain. When Ilara finally slipped out of the building, the city was just beginning to stir, its cold, morning breath a harsh shock after the charged intimacy of Julian's world. She felt disoriented, as if she had woken from a dream so vivid it had rewritten her own reality. The memory of the kiss was a physical brand on her lips, and the weight of his grief, a secret she now carried, settled deep within her bones. She was no longer just a book restorer or a caregiver. She was the keeper of a broken man's soul, a responsibility that was as terrifying as it was profound. Her own quiet, predictable life now seemed like a faded photograph of a person she no longer was. Returning to her apartment was like stepping backward through time, a violent collision with the life she had momentarily escaped. The familiar, suffocating smell of antiseptic and steeped tea immediately constricted her chest, erasing the clean, empty scent of Julian's world. Her mother was already awake, her sharp, worried eyes cataloging Ilara's disheveled state, the faint tremor in her hands. The questions came not with warmth, but with the sharp edge of suspicion. "Where have you been? You look a fright." Ilara murmured a vague excuse about a difficult night at work, the lie feeling clumsy and foreign in her mouth. For the first time, a true and impassable wall stood between them, built from a secret she could never share. The guilt was a physical sickness, a bitter taste in her throat. She had bought her mother's security with a piece of her own soul, and the transaction felt both necessary and monstrous. In the sterile silence of his penthouse, Julian was a prisoner of the morning light. The tenderness he had felt, the raw vulnerability he had allowed Ilara to witness, now felt like a catastrophic failure of his defenses. He replayed the moment of her compassion, the soft cadence of her voice reading poetry, the desperate, healing pressure of her lips on his. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, he had felt something other than rage. He had felt seen. That feeling was a threat, a weakness his self-loathing couldn't tolerate. The ghost of Amelia was a constant, accusing presence, her memory a sacred ground he had just desecrated with a new connection. He was convinced that his darkness was a contagion, that he was destined to destroy anyone who got too close. To protect Ilara, he had to become the monster again. It was the only act of love he believed he was capable of. The external world breached his fortress that afternoon in the form of his older sister, Catherine Croft. She arrived without warning, a sleek, formidable woman encased in expensive silk and radiating an aura of cold, corporate power. She moved through the penthouse not as a visitor, but as an inspector, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She had heard whispers from the network of staff that served the Croft empire, whispers of a new caregiver, a quiet girl who had somehow lasted. Her questions about Ilara were meticulously casual, but each one was a precisely aimed probe designed to gauge the nature and depth of their relationship. Catherine was the embodiment of the world he had tried to escape, a world of calculated alliances and public persecution, and her presence was a stark, unwelcome reminder that his gilded cage had bars he could never truly break. With the chilling precision of a surgeon, Catherine laid out the family's verdict. "This girl, Julian. People are talking. A pretty, penniless thing with a sick mother, the narrative writes itself." She didn't need to say the words fortune hunter. They hung in the air between them, ugly and venomous. She spoke of the company, of the shareholders, of the legacy their father had built. Then came the threat, delivered with a placid, terrifying smile. "If she becomes a problem, we will solve it. We will dig into her life,
her family's debts, and we will paint a picture for the press. She won't survive it. It was a declaration of war, not against Ilara herself, but against the very idea of her. They would crush her gentle, quiet world under the immense, impersonal weight of their power and wealth, all to protect the pristine, cold image of the Croft name. Catherine's words were a poison that found fertile ground in Julian's guilt. He envisioned the brutal reality of her threats. Ilara's face on tabloid websites, her mother hounded by reporters, her quiet dignity shredded for public consumption.
He had lived through that hell once before, after the accident that killed Amelia, and the memory was a raw, gaping wound. He would not, could not, subject Ilara to that. He saw it as a terrible, noble choice. To save her from the wreckage of his life, he had to sever her from it completely. He had to wield his cruelty like a shield, to inflict a wound so deep she would be forced to flee for her own survival. He would become her villain to prevent his family from becoming hers. It was a sacrifice born of a twisted, broken love, the only kind he had left to give. That evening, the air in the penthouse was not just cold, it was a vacuum from which all warmth had been violently sucked. Ilara felt it the moment she stepped through the door. Julian was waiting, his chair positioned in the center of the vast room, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He didn't allow her to approach, his voice stopping her in her tracks. "Your services will no longer be required," he said, the words clipped, impersonal, devoid of any emotion. He spoke of a generous severance package, of confidentiality agreements, of the end of their professional arrangement. He deliberately used the language of a cold corporate transaction, systematically dismantling every moment of intimacy they had shared, reducing their connection to a line item on a balance sheet. He was forcing her to see him as nothing more than her employer, a cruel, capricious millionaire who had simply grown tired of his latest acquisition. The verbal blows landed with a brutal physical force, knocking the air from her lungs. She stared at him, desperately searching the icy blue of his eyes for a trace of the man who had confessed his grief to her just one night before. But he was gone. In his place was a cold, cruel stranger. The emotional whiplash was dizzying, a nauseating lurch from soul-bearing intimacy to absolute rejection. She couldn't find her voice to ask, why, to fight, to understand. A uniformed assistant she had never seen before appeared, holding out an envelope. The severance check. It was a final, burning humiliation. Payment for a service that had become something sacred to her. She turned and walked out, moving like an automaton. The echoing click of the closing door, a sound of absolute finality. The heartbreak was so profound, so complete, it left no room for tears, only a vast, hollow numbness. In the days that followed, their separate worlds became mirroring prisons of silent agony. Ilara returned to her workshop, the comforting scent of old paper now feeling like the dust of a tomb. She would pick up a delicate tool, her hand poised over a broken spine, and see only the memory of his hand covering hers. The stories of passion and tragedy bound in the books she mended were a constant, painful echo of what she had touched and lost. Julian, meanwhile, roamed his silent penthouse, the absence of her quiet presence a deafening roar. Every corner held a memory of her. He had successfully driven her away, protecting her from his world, but in doing so, he had plunged himself into a darkness far more profound and desolate than any he had known before. He was safe, and he was utterly, completely alone. The crushing weight of heartbreak slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to change. For Ilara, the initial shock gave way to a quiet, simmering ember of defiance. The pain was real, but so was the memory of his vulnerability. The two Julians, the broken man who had wept in her arms and the cold tyrant who had dismissed her, could not coexist. One of them was a lie. And she knew, with a certainty that resonated in the deepest part of her being, that the monster was the mask, not the man. That night had not just been a transgression, it had been an awakening. She had discovered a strength within herself, a capacity for a connection so profound it terrified her. He had pushed her away, but he had also inadvertently shown her that she was no longer a woman who would retreat into the quiet safety of mending other people's stories. She was ready to fight for her own. Weeks bled into a month, a period of quiet, seismic change for Ilara Vance. The severance money, a sum that felt both like a wound and a balm, had silenced the most threatening of the red-lettered envelopes, granting her a fragile, unfamiliar peace. In her workshop, surrounded by the familiar scent of aging stories, she discovered that the silence no longer felt loneliness. It was a space for reflection. The memory of Julian's cruelty had faded, leaving behind the indelible image of his confession, his vulnerability. She looked at her own hands, the hands he had first noticed, and understood their true purpose. They were not just for mending the past of others, but for carefully, deliberately constructing a future of her own. She would not be a ghost, haunting the edges of her own life. She deserved an ending, or a beginning, that she wrote herself. The return to the glass and steel tower was a pilgrimage of a different sort. She wore the same simple dress, but she inhabited it differently. Her shoulders back, her steps measured and sure. There was no fear this time, only a calm, unwavering resolve. She bypassed the severe assistant she remembered, addressing a new face at the security desk with a quiet authority that brooked no argument.
As the silent elevator ascended, she felt not the crushing anxiety of her first visit, but the steady, rhythmic beat of a heart that knew its purpose. She was not there to reclaim a job or to plead for his affection. She was there to confront a truth, to look the monster he had pretended to be in the eye and show him the man she knew was still there. The pristine, silent hallway felt less like a corridor to a king's throne and more like the approach to a final, necessary reckoning. The heavy door swung open with a soft electronic hiss. It was Julian who opened it, his silhouette framed in the doorway from his chair. He looked diminished, the sharp edges of his anger worn down by something that looked like exhaustion. A storm of conflicting emotions passed across his face: shock, disbelief, and a flicker of the old defensive fury. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp, an attempt to reconstruct the walls she had breached. But Ilara did not retreat. She stepped over the threshold, her presence a quiet defiance of his command. She moved further into the vast, empty room, her gaze never leaving his, forcing him to see that she was not the same timid girl he had dismissed. She held out a small, cloth-wrapped object. "I believe this is yours," she said, her voice clear and steady, a single true note in the echoing silence. She unwrapped it to reveal a small, exquisitely restored volume. It was not poetry, but a children's story, its leather cover a warm, rich brown against the cold monochrome of the room. The Velveteen Rabbit. She placed it gently on the glass table between them, a fragile bridge connecting their two worlds. "You showed me the man you were," she began, her voice soft but unwavering, "and I refuse to believe he's gone. This anger, this cruelty, it's just the stuffing.
It's what you use to protect yourself from becoming real. Because becoming real hurts. It means pieces of you can be worn away or broken. She looked at him, her moss-green eyes filled not with pity, but with a profound, unshakable understanding. I know. I spent my whole life being careful, trying not to get worn out. But that's not living. It's just waiting. Julian stared at the book, its title a quiet accusation. Her words dismantled his defenses more effectively than any argument could have. She saw him. She saw the terrified man behind the mask of the monster, and she was not afraid. He didn't need to confess about his sister's threats or the brutal choice he had made. The truth was there, shimmering in the charged air between them. He had pushed her away not for lack of feeling, but because of its terrifying, overwhelming presence. It was a misguided, desperate act of protection. Slowly, as if moving through water, he reached out his hand. His fingers, long and elegant, did not touch her, but rested on the worn leather of the book, a silent admission of everything he couldn't say. It was a gesture of complete and utter surrender to the truth she had brought back to him. She had her answer. It was in his silence, in the raw vulnerability that had returned to his eyes. A small, sad smile touched her lips, and she turned to leave, her own story now ready for its next chapter. Ilara. His voice stopped her, a fragile, broken sound. She looked back. He couldn't promise her a future free of pain or complication. He couldn't erase the scars that defined him. But as he looked from the small book to her steady, capable hands, a flicker of something new, something like hope, ignited in the depths of his gaze. "The hand that holds," he whispered, "the words of vow. It can mend more than just books." It was not a happy ending, but a real one. A difficult, uncertain, and beautiful beginning. If you believe a love like theirs is worth fighting for, subscribe to our channel, share this story, and tell us in the comments what you think their next chapter should be.